Okay. Okay, so on the very first verse in this historic portion, these are the children of Yitzchak. Rashi explains what is the meaning of the word Toldos. Who's Toldos referring to? Rashi says this is referring to Yaakov and Esav, who are discussed in 6 parsha. And then Rashi addresses why it says Avram gave birth to Yitzchak. Rashi is wondering, why does it say Avram gave birth to Yitzchak? If the Torah already said that Yitzchak is the son of Avram, what's the purpose of this extra word? And so Rashi explains that because the Torah says that Avram gave birth to Yitzchak, Avram was the father of Yitzchak, so the Torah had to give proof to what it said, because the scoffers, the generation, they were saying that Sarah became pregnant with Avimelech. In order to dispel the rumor of the scoffers that Avram was not the father of Yitzchak, so God did a miracle, and he made the face of Yitzchak look identical to Abraham. So everyone was able to testify and say, as the verse continues, Abraham gave birth to Yitzchak. It wasn't just a fact, it was something that everyone could see because of the miracle that God did. So the reason why Rashi needs to explain something here is because the Torah says these are the offspring of Yitzchak, but doesn't say who the offspring is. And therefore Rashi has to explain that the offspring of Yitzchak is referring to something that's discussed later on, Yaakov and Esav. Although it's not in the immediate verse right afterwards, that's what the pasuk is referring to. And that's why Rashi uses an unusual expression. Rashi says, who are discussed in the parsha. It doesn't say who are discussed later. Like Nachmanides says the word lamata. They're discussed later. Because when you say the word lamata later in the language of the commentators of the Torah, the word lamata, which means further on, could mean the very next verse. And therefore Rashi says, although it's not the very next verse, it's still the meaning of the word Toldos, and they're discussed in this parsha, not in the very next verse, but later on. But the question is like this: why does the Torah interrupt the children of Yitzchak and discuss something else? Why doesn't it immediately just say who the children of Yitzchak are? Okay, so Rashi addresses what it means, but the question is, why does the Torah interrupt, not just straight out, these are the children of Yitzchak? So Rashi explains, first of all, I need to tell you, the Torah needs to tell us that Yitzchak is the son of Abraham. And therefore the Torah has to add the words, Yitzchak is the son of Abraham, Abraham gave birth to Yitzchak, because of the scoffers of the generation. The Torah has to interrupt its discussion of the children of Yitzchak, because we have to figure out who Yitzchak is in the first place. Once the Torah tells us Yitzchak is the son of Abraham, the Torah has to stop. The Torah has to say, okay, let me tell you about Yitzchak being the son of Abraham. I know people are saying it's not true. So I want you to know what happened. That Hashem made Yitzchak's face look identical to Abraham. So that's why the Torah doesn't immediately go into the children of Yitzchak, because once it says Yitzchak is the son of Abraham, there's an immediate need to dispel the rumors of the scoffers. But the question, though, is another question. There's another alternative explanation of the words Toldos Yitzchak. Rashi could have explained the words Toldos Yitzchak, the events of Yitzchak's life, the chronicles of Yitzchak, the biography of Yitzchak. As Rashi explains the words later on in the Torah, Toldos Yaakov. Toldos Yaakov are referred to the events of Yaakov's life. And similarly, Toldos Shemaim v'Aretz v'Barim, the chronicles of the heaven and earth, refers to the chronicles, what happened in the heaven and earth. Back in Bereshis and Genesis, the Torah talks about creation of the heaven and the earth. The Torah says these are the Toldos, these are the chronicles of the heaven and the earth. And the Torah begins to discuss what happened when God made the world. So why does Rashi need to say the word Toldos here refers to children, and then have to explain why the Torah stops and says Yitzchak is Avram gave birth to Yitzchak? He could have just explained this verse as saying something else. He could have just said this verse is the word Toldos doesn't mean children. Toldos means events, the chronicles. So we'll understand this based upon a theme that the Rebbe developed in this year, 1965, Tashon Chafei, where the Rebbe explains that the reason why Parsha has a name is not just because it's the beginning of the Parsha. Rather, it's because this name encapsulates the content of the whole Parsha. In other words, it's precisely the opposite. Because this name encapsulates the content of the Parsha, that's why this word was said to be in the beginning at the head of the Parsha, because this is the word that has everything the Parsha in it. Hashem put that word there because this is the word that you need for this Parsha. A proof of this is in this week's Parsha. The word Toldos is first, we have that word at the beginning of a Parsha in Parshas Noach. These are the Toldos of Noach. And yet Parshas Noach isn't called Toldos. Even if the Torah would always try to use the very first word of a portion, then Parshas Noach would have been called Noach, and Parshas Toldos would have been called Yitzchak. Use the first word at the first opportunity and call Parshas Noach Toldos, because that's the second word of the Parsha, Elo Toldos Noach. And here you already used up the word Noach, so now use the third word of the Parsha, Yitzchak. But the Torah doesn't do that. The Torah skips the word Noach, the word Toldos rather, in Parshas Noach, and calls that Parsha Parshas Noach. And Torah then goes back to the second word of the Parsha here and calls this Parsha Parshas Toldos. Tells you something. It tells you the Torah is not trying to use the very first word of the Parsha. So we must say that there's a connection between the content of the Parsha and the name of the Parsha. And that's why it's called Noach. What's the meaning of the word Noach? The word Noach means nachas, comfort, naicha derucha. Through the events and the stories that happened in Parshas Noach, the world finally settled. The waters of the flood purified the world. God smelled the fragrance of the sacrifices of Noach. God made a covenant with Noach. So the theme of that parsha is all about tranquility, how to get to the birth of Avraham Avinu, until the very last words of that parsha, where it says that Terach dies in Haran, and what explanation of that is that God's anger ceased. So that's why the Parshas Noach is all about Noach. And this Parsha is all about Toldos, and that's why it's called Toldos. And that's why Rashi says that the word Toldos means Yaakov and Esav, because the content of the Parsha is Toldos Kipshuta, it's about offspring, about the children of Yaakov, of Yitzchak. And since Rashi is not trying to explain the names of the Parsha, Rashi explains the simple meaning of the verse, we must say that Rashi has a proof for this from the verse itself. The beginning of the Parsha is Ve'ele Toldos Yitzchak. And these are the Toldos of Yitzchak. Whenever there's a Vav in a word, the Vav is a connecting. Vav means and. It connects to something that's said before. So you cannot say that this verse is merely talking about the events of Yitzchak's life, because the verses before this verse are not connected to the events of Yitzchak's life. The last words of the previous parsha are not about Yitzchak, they're about the children of Yishmael. And Yishmael and Yitzchak have no connection to each other. As we see in the previous portion, a huge difference between Yitzchak and Yishmael. To Yitzchak, Avram gives everything that he has, but to the children of the concubines, Avram just gives them gifts and sends them away. And therefore, Rashi says that the word ve'ela is a continuation of the word ve'ela is not talking about the events of Yitzchak's life, because if it was talking about the events of Yitzchak's life, then it wouldn't be continuation of the parsha before. Rashi says Toldos here is actually referring to Yaakov and Esav. And that's why it's a continuation of the parsha before. Esav was wicked like Yishmael was wicked. Although Yishmael does tshuva and Esav doesn't, but here we're talking about the offspring of Yishmael. So, in continuation to the children of Abraham who went off and made mistakes and led horrible lives. So we have a continuation in Yitzchak. Yitzchak also has a son who lives a horrible life, and he is also an offspring of Yitzchak. So now we can explain the difference between Noach and Toldos. Parshas Noach does not begin with the letter Vav. Just as Eila Toldos Noach. Parshas Toldos begins with the letter Vav, Ve'eila. Because Parshas Noach is not a continuation of Parshas Bereishis. On the contrary, by not putting the letter Vav in the beginning of Parshas Noach, the Torah is clearly demarcating the life of Noach from the Parsha Bereishis, that the generation of the flood and those who caused the flood to happen were different to Noach. Noach was different than all those people. Parshas Bereishis talks about the world the way it was before it was purified, and why God regretted making the world. Parshas Noach is the exact opposite. How God promises they'll never destroy the world again, how there's going to be a new world, the world of tranquility, and that's why it's not a continuation of the parsha before. This helps us answer another question. The reason why the Torah says that Avram gave birth to Yitzchak, again, is to dispel the notion of the scoffers of the generation. Questions like this. The only reason why we had to dispel the notion of the scoffers of the generation was because we said some words. What were the words we said? Yitzchak is the son of Abraham. Oh, 1 second, prove that. But why do we have to even say Yitzchak is the son of Abraham? We know from the previous Torah portion and the one before that Yitzchak is the son of Abraham. So we should have just started off with Yitzchak marries Rivka at the age of 40. Why does the Torah have to say it all? Yitzchak is the son of Avram. Rashi says once it says Yitzchak is the son of Avram, there's a need now to dispel the notion of the scoffers of the generation. The question is, why even say that? So based upon what we said earlier, we can answer the question. The word Ve'el Toldos Yitzchak is a continuation to the offspring of Yitzchak, is a continuation of the story of the offspring of Yishmael. About Yishmael, the Torah says Yishmael was the son of Abraham. And we have to say about Yishmael that he was the son of Avram. Because when you read the story of Yishmael and his offspring, he had 12 children, all 12 leaders emerged from him, 12 tribes from Yishmael. You wonder, how did Yishmael have such a great expansion of his family? So the Torah has to clarify and say, you know why Yishmael had all this? Because he was the son of Avram. It was his own blessing, chas v'shalom. It's because Avram prayed for Yishmael. Because Avram prayed and asked for Yishmael, that's why there's a huge expansion in Yishmael's family. It means the Torah has to say, look at the incredible growth of Yishmael's family. The Torah has to say, how did he get that? He got it from Avram. Because of the chesed that Avram had, there's room for Yishmael. As Avram asked, let Yishmael live. And he asked that Yishmael should live before Hashem. He should live connected to God's infinite kindness. So much so that it says that Hashem sustained 26 generations because of his kindness. You know, the virtue of all these generations, they didn't have anything good going on them, but Hashem sustained them with his kindness. So Avram asked that Yishmael should also get in touch with God's infinite kindness, have infinite blessing. That's what Avram was into. That's what Avram was about. And kindness. Nevertheless, regarding Yitzchak, there's a whole different kind of relationship. You can't connect Avram to Yishmael in the same way you're connecting Yitzchak to Avram. Because that there's a whole kind of connection. Yes, Avram had kindness, Yishmael wanted to live, and it caused expansion of his family. But the kind of connection Avram has is far greater, incomparably greater. So it makes sense. Once you say Yishmael is the son of Avram, it wouldn't make sense to only say, and Yitzchak, not to say he's the son of Avram. That sounds like he's less than Yishmael. Therefore, the Torah has to say that Yitzchak is the son of Avram. And since the Torah says that Yitzchak is the son of Avram, the Torah then has to clarify and say, yes, Avram did give birth to Yitzchak. Number one, to dispel the notion of the scoffers as a generation. And number two, in order to show that Torah associates Yishmael with Avram's kindness, Avram and everything, but the relationship that Avram has with Yitzchak is a whole different level. Yitzchak is not just a son of Avram. Avram gives birth to Yitzchak. Avram is all about Yitzchak. And that's the essence of Avram. As the Torah says, only with Yitzchak can you correctly say this is your offspring. Mr. Hashem will continue tomorrow. And so basically clarified very, very amazingly the reason why, number one, this parsha is Parshas Toldos, not the parsha of Noach. We explained that Toldos specifically refers not to the events of Yitzchak's life, but to the children of Yitzchak. We know this because of the letter Vav, which connects this parsha to the parsha before. And the connection in the parsha before is we're contrasting Yitzchak's children with Yishmael's children. We explain why at all the Torah has to say that Yitzchak is the son of Abraham, because the Torah already said that Yishmael is the son of Abraham. And therefore we have to highlight and say that Avram and Yitzchak have a whole different kind of relationship, and not like it Avram's relationship with Yitzchak. Avram's relationship with Yishmael. All right, that's what I wanted to share today. Have a great day.